inviting us. We appreciate it. We're going to leave time for Q&A, but we're going to pretty much do a presentation of what you just heard in the bio as what the shifting landscape of resistance looks like and the type of relations we're making today that blur the lines between art, activism, organizing in the city, but also in Palestine. And just as an introduction, what you just received is something that got printed in 20,000 copies, and it's in Arabic and English, and it's being first distributed in Palestine. And this is an example of the kind of work that we do, just one of the aspects of the media we produce as being embedded in struggle and in movements.
There's no Arabic.
Not in that one. Each one is different. So the Arabic was in Palestine, but there's a PDF online.
We actually began our practice as photographers. We went to ICP. I came from India in 2009 and joined the ICP program, which is the International Center for Photography. And Amin was a lawyer and gave up law and began also at the program in 2009. And that's where we met and we formed MTL Collective. And one of the first things that we did was actually begin a project, visualizing kind of a research project on Palestine. So this is actually an image from our first trip. This was in December 2010, where we were just trying to understand the cartography of the occupation, visually, like settlements being on the mountaintops, checkpoints, flying checkpoints, everything that we know about Palestine, and trying to see what kind of image making makes sense for the context of Palestine. And just, documenting and photographing without really thinking about what kind of a project do we want it to be. So some of the images from that time was thinking of the horizon line and the sky. So just like experimenting with that. So these are some of the images that are from Palestine around that time. Do you want to add anything?
No.
And so, and then on January 25th, 2011, Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire in Tunisia, which also began the Arab uprisings. And during that time, we were in New York and thinking, what can we do while being in New York? So one of the projects we did was Arab Uprising newspapers, which was basically take newspapers from Palestine, from Syria, 7 different countries, and take out the advertisements from that and annotate. This is not translation, but actually annotating, what is going on and what kind of media coverage is lacking here in this city, and putting them in like public squares like Union Square, Bryant Park, Times Square, and places like that. And very quickly, right after that, yeah.
One of the things that was really important about that is visually and aesthetically making the connection with Palestine and throwing rocks, and you see the rocks coming up in relation to the caravan and what Trump recently said. And then the other aspect is that how cities are set up to not have rocks and not have bricks, because that's how they control you, right? So we were going and getting bricks and rocks from a lot of different places to make them in the city available, so that there comes a moment when someone will carry a brick and hit a cop car.
It's actually very difficult to find rocks in the city. So 2011 was also the time when the 15M movement happened in Spain. There was also a movement in India around workers deoccupying a factory. There was a moment that was happening globally, and at that time we started organizing for Occupy Wall Street on August 2nd, which was the first meeting that happened, which was to basically lead to an occupation of Zuccotti Park, which was later on named as Liberty Park. This was the initial map that was distributed. There's 8 locations, and this was the map that was given. Our first option was to take over the Chase Manhattan Plaza because the cops knew that area was barricaded, and then the second option was Liberty Park, and then we basically were able to set up the occupation there. Do you want to talk more about this?
No, I mean, it was really important to the reason why we're starting from here is we're thinking about this cartography and we're thinking about the landscape, because this is the background for the kind of shifting in relationships that we've been working on since 2010, 2011. And it comes up often in relation to demands in relation to leadership, hierarchy. Well, what is your solution? And so thinking about Palestine not necessarily as an exception, but with its specificity and as an example, and as Jasbir Puar would say, our future here. And in that or as Fred Moten would say, I don't need your help, I just need I need you to know this thing is killing you too, right? And from there, what kind of coalition can emerge?
I think some of the main things about Occupy Wall Street were that there was a lot of conversation around why name it Occupy Wall Street, right? Like we're already on occupied land, further Occupy Wall Street, and that was something that people gave away. But one of the main things around Occupy Wall Street that was hugely problematic was, of course, its name. But also, the second thing was that even though there was a lot of organizers of color in the movement, that often got colorblinded or whitewashed into this is predominantly, a white middle class movement asking, a generation that got demoted. And the third thing was specifically around Palestine, the General Assembly and in general the Declaration was not willing to take any stand on Palestine. And there was something that happened where there was a statement that was made eventually on the website, which was further taken down because it was actually a Zionist statement. I don't know, do you remember that? Okay. And so during that time, what we were doing was, just like this, and on the same printer, publishing a journal called Tidal, which included voices from people in the movement on the ground and people like Gayatri Spivak, Judith Butler, and mixing that kind of theory and action and seeing what kind of a movement are we looking for in our city. So not like, simultaneously theorizing and representing, but like thinking about what are some of the challenges we are facing as a movement. And so, this was thinking about debt.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that this is very relevant for Palestine right now is that Palestine is at an intersection of both neoliberal late capitalism, a proxy for an occupation or a colonizer in the Palestinian Authority or the leadership of Hamas. It kind of doesn't matter. And what does it mean to fight for your liberation? And I think this is why decolonization is being reconfigured and relevant. But it's no longer self-determination being synonymous with statehood, right? So that's one thing that you have to reconsider. And then the other thing that you have to reconsider is most Palestinians have debt. This was very intentional. And debt is future time, future labor. So what does it mean to say free Palestine? And we're interested in asking these questions, and we're interested in asking the difficult questions and complicating it, because it's really sad for all of us to fight ineffectively, to resist ineffectively. No, go back just a little bit. So very early on in 2011, and this journal is available at the NYU library, and it's in the archive, and it showed up in a bunch of biennials later, and it's a really big deal because it has Gayatri Spivak, Judith Butler. But the way it was configured was not, hey, write for this journal. It's just like, we have these issues, can we talk about them? And then can you write in a way that people understand you? And then, you know what I mean? And then and so these were very important things, because what we were thinking about is like, how can we resist effectively on the ground? And we were also trying to make these connections, and this magazine was the first issue was 20,000 that got distributed by people. The second issue came out on May Day, 50,000 copies in print. And there were 4 issues in total, and they were irregular, and they came out when we felt the movement needed it. And I think that this one over here was collaborative work, that by this time people came around to Palestine. And one of the ways in which we kind of made the argument about Palestine is that everything crosses through Wall Street, right? And understanding that made the kind of relationships maybe too late, but made them.
I think you should finish it too.
Okay. So
the images
that's fine. I mean, this is an image after Hurricane Sandy, and it's of downtown. Well, it's of Wall Street, and the only thing that's lit up is Goldman Sachs. Right? There was no electricity. I think whoever was here remembers that. So okay. So the reason, I mean, part of what we're doing here is showing you the infrastructure that exists in the city, in which right now, through the organizing for Hurricane Sandy, we opened up several of the churches. But it wasn't for charity. It wasn't just humanitarian. There was organizing happening out of those spaces. There was art being made. There were people organizing communities. This one is in 520 Clinton. Me and a few others opened another one in Staten Island. I was out there for 3 months. And in Staten Island, we were doing the organizing house to house. There were other people in the Rockaway and so forth. This infrastructure later got deployed during Black Lives Matter, and it got deployed during the war in Gaza in 2014. And this space over here, the clergy had decided that that was an anti-Zionist space, and that people can go in there and pray, and things like that can happen. So it's showing you the kind of infrastructure that exists here for our movements in ways that we don't separate the issues because we know they're connected.
Also, this church eventually later on, when we'll talk about Direct Action Front for Palestine, became a huge hub of organizing during the Gaza war in 2014. And then this is just to kind of show like the back and forth between like our practice here in New York and in Palestine, and also in Abu Dhabi and Delhi, but which is not part of the presentation today. But this is in 2013. We went for 3 months and started thinking about the cartography of an occupation. We were commissioned by Creative Time reports to do 3 different pieces on Palestine. So first of them was Palestine, a cartography of an occupation, which was of course understanding how the occupation is functioning. But also we were thinking about the refugees who are in Jordan and specifically coming from Egypt and Lebanon. At the same time, there was a lot of refugees that were coming in from Syria to Jordan. And so what we did was actually go to have conversations in refugee camps in Jordan, like Bakka refugee camp, Gaza refugee camp, and understanding how are they creating the infrastructure for Syrian refugees who are also fleeing Zatri camp, which is one of the biggest refugee camps in Jordan and probably the world at this point. But and what does it mean to be a refugee when there's no nation state? And what kind of new alliances are being formed between the Syrian refugees and the Palestinian refugees during that time? So this is just some of the media work that we do along those lines. But I mean, the images.
Yeah, the images. Well, you would have saw this in the New York Times 2 days ago. While she pulls it up, I mean, part of what we established was Direct Action Front for Palestine when the Gaza war happened, but using the same relationships that we had in the movements. And it's good to think of movements as moments of rupture, and that just for a movement takes about 10 years to develop in its analysis and intersectionality. And if you think of Occupy focusing just on class, at the expense of racial justice, at the expense of indigenous struggle, then what you see are corrective measures that have happened since. So you have Black Lives Matter. You have the kind of strong movement around Palestine. You had no DAPL, no Dakota Access Pipeline. You have Me Too right now. These are very important ruptures that are building towards what could be a sustainable movement, right? So this was recently out. Now, this image here, we want to show you, Direct Action Front for Palestine was working out of that church, so we had infrastructure. We used our connections. This is a flag that's 90 feet by 45 feet. It was bought with cash. It was sewed over 3 weeks in the basement of 4 churches with no phones, high level of secrecy, and a decoy of a march going on the Brooklyn Bridge and really pushing that, where there were thousands of people on the Brooklyn Bridge, but this got dropped on the Manhattan Bridge when the march was halfway. And the people that dropped it were about 8 people, and it was 2 priests, a nun, right? Because we set it up so that if they did get caught, that the city would look really stupid prosecuting them. And then the other thing is that, this is just a little bit in thinking about the range of how we think this to be. People trained to drop that in under 20 seconds, right? And there were bikes on the other side So we knew who's on the bridge, who's not on the bridge. And there was only one way to get out, which is to get off the bridge. That meant that the police would be coming when you're trying to leave. And so people had dressed differently, used profiling to their advantage, all of these kind of things. No one got caught, it got deployed, it was up there for 20 minutes. That image went viral. It went viral, and I think it's important to say at what scale it went viral. I mean, Hamas tweeted it, Muslim Brotherhood tweeted it, Fatah tweeted it, the range and across the globe. And there's a lot that could be said in terms of the tactics that are involved and what does it mean to make an image that the New York Times wouldn't publish, but you forced them to. And this is the first time, and they keep using it. It's astonishing. Haaretz uses it. They just keep using it. And I mean, there was a lot going on because there was people on both sides who were taking pictures and video. But the thousands of people who then saw it drop became media makers. And that's another reason why it went viral.
But also there are two other aspects to it, which is like while this thing was happening, there's something called as a collective roar that happened at the same time. So also the energy of also doing these marches and actions for us, not just trying to protest something, right? So start to thinking about like what kind of formations do we build in that city? What kind of relationships do we make for organizing? The other thing was that the strategy of saying boycott, divest, sanctions on the flag, which basically meant that anybody who covered this image had to talk about what the BDS movement was, which was something they had to explain. So even Fox News had to explain what BDS is. And so that was another strategy within it, right? So, Zionist institutions, Zionist medias, they also had to explain what the BDS movement is because of this banner drop. And then on the top it says Gaza in our hearts, if it doesn't.
Yeah, and one last thing I think that it's important to say, so there was a high level of training, there was really kind of protecting each other, there was making sure that we had legal counsel, that there was jail support, there were people on standby for bail because there are federal charges associated with that. If you look, there are red lights. We were monitoring that for about a week to know, because it's a high traffic area, right? And we had to guess 90 feet. We could have gone more, but 90 feet, will it touch a ship? Because it could have been criminal negligence, and if someone got hurt, and then it's bad. So we really, like, there's a light, if you were closer you would see it, and these lights are regular this way, so we knew exactly where it was going to drop, right?
I hope the images are...
This just says don't play with apartheid, but I think the point that you could make about this is that it doesn't take much to make a banner, right? You could just spray paint and a bed sheet, right? And it has a sense of urgency to it. This was in the news a lot because they went into, I think Maccabi Tel Aviv was playing at Barclays Center, and so there was an altercation inside. And one thing I didn't mention is like the principle of direct action front for Palestine was that the people that are oppressed must lead the movement in relation to Palestine. And this was a shift from, we're going to put the people who are privileged on the front line, right? Because that liberation, we felt strongly that we needed to come out of the, come out of the shadows of 9/11, where everyone was afraid to do anything, and we wanted to do the direct actions, and we wanted to shut down bridges, and we wanted to do these things. It was us, and we needed to lead that movement. By us, I mean we were constructing it. It wasn't ready. But there were Palestinians their voices were centering Palestinian voices. It was centering people of color. It was centering black folks, those who were most oppressed, those on the margins. That's the alliances that we're going to prioritize beyond just kind of like white people with a lot of money and privilege. That was a strategic choice that was made in 2014. That's a video. So that's This is another of the actions that was done. And I can just preface this by saying, how can we bring it back to Wall Street again? How can we level blows against Israel that isn't just a protest? And how can it also be pedagogical? And how can it be a decolonial formation, decolonial gatherings in which we come together and map out our city? And what we researched were the Israeli banks that were funding settlements, and we found them, and then we did this to one of them. So Direct Action Front for Palestine, we would have organizing meetings in the church. We wanted to do an action. You would bifurcate strategy and risk, right? But the strategy, you would bifurcate the idea of like there's different levels of risk and involvement by which people can participate in. But then you bring them together. So there was a march that took the police further away from the target. And there were people that were just in the cafeteria. And so when the march was further away, the thing happened. So it was able to generate media and photographs, and we were the first media makers. This is a context where we knew there were going to be arrests, and a lot of the folks are Jewish, and a lot of the folks are from former activists in ACT UP, right? So they have the kind of training and experience, and we offered up all the kind of support that was needed to take care of them, wait for them, have dumplings for them when they came out of the arrest. Very different than a civil disobedience. I want to be clear. There is no reason to let the state take your body, right? Just to kind of make an image. This was something extremely transgressive that happened in the middle of Midtown that let the bank know we know where they are. What that does is that it increases their cost of security. And if you look right now, there's less signs of these places. They've changed the architecture of the place. Because it's not meant for day-to-day going there. It's just for the money that's on, the Diamond District, whatever kind of relationship that, the customers have with Israel, but it's high, they call it high net worth individuals.
I mean, also this bank later on comes in when we'll talk about the Brooklyn Museum to fund a show on Palestine/Israel. So like, there's also this like ongoing mapping of where these things show up in the city, in museums, on the street with a bank, in institutions like the university and etc. So there's like this constant understanding of how power flows and how do you make it visible. So this was also the time when the Ferguson uprising started in Ferguson, and there was kind of, there's always been a history of, Black solidarity, Black liberation struggles, relationship with Palestine. We know that from the Black Panthers, but specifically during this time, the company that makes tear gas, it's based in Pennsylvania, is the same tear gas that was used in Ferguson, is used in Palestine, and also was used in Egypt. During the Arab uprisings in Egypt. And so there were people at that time tweeting to people, protesters in Ferguson, saying, okay, these are the ways that you can actually survive tear gas, right? What are the tactics? And so that kind of solidarity was already emerging. And so what we did was, that time, on the left-hand side, there's a banner that says Gaza is Ferguson is Wounded Knee. And on the right-hand side, it says Stand with Gaza, that's in a march in Ferguson. So there was already these kind of conversations that were happening more now, right? In like how do these struggles come together? How do we organize? How do we build together? And so what we did was.
Sorry, I didn't realize.
I think it was fine.
Yeah, I don't know why it's doing that.
It was I don't know.
See if there's another one afterwards, or they're all.
No,
like that?
it's coming.
Oh.
Let me just see. I'll just do this. Do you want to talk? I'll just pull up the thing. You can talk about the banner.
I don't know. So part of what was important after the war on Gaza was still, was going on in Ferguson is that there was about 2 vans that went from over here, from Direct Action Front for Palestine, and spent about a week, 10 days there. And in that process had really fruitful conversations. But then, by the way, I just want to say that tweet that you saw, the person that's in it was murdered. There's been several activists from Ferguson that have been found lynched. And this was October 15 in the New York Times, so you can read about it. It hasn't gotten much coverage. But this is the lynching and the vigilantism that happens. They make people pay a price for the resistance that you do. So I thought it was important to note that. One of the things that we did was that we made banners when Eric Garner was murdered, and we made 11 banners that were 34 feet by 2 feet or 5 feet. And took them to the Millions March that was coming out of Washington Square. But that night before, so we spent several nights making those. It's important to say that we made them as an act of solidarity, right? And we deployed them as an addition to what was already happening. And that's in other words a concept of affinity. Everyone tries to go in and kind of engage in the same thing versus making other spaces that make it difficult for them to control us and for us to all be free in the ways to resist in the ways we know how, right? And in these banners, we sent one to where Eric Garner was murdered, so that was the first one that went up. But these banners then shut down intersections because with banners, they're tactical. They organize a march, they make an image come out strong and visible. It can cross over, and then you don't need 1 million people to shut down an intersection, right?
Yeah, that's fine there.
Okay.
Same, that's the presentation. I don't know why it's showing well.
Let's change that.
I was just gonna do that, but that's good. Okay, the computer. Because most of them are really low resolution.
Yeah, I don't know what,
Yeah, that's much better.
Yeah, that's good. So you see what they look like?
You can press present.
Yeah, I
on top.
can do that.
okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. Also, the kufiyya pattern on the right hand side as an act of solidarity, showing that visually.
This was the night that we finished them before we deployed them the night before, that day before, the day after. So,
And that's the march on the left hand side that happened at the same time as the banner drop, the one that we showed you on Manhattan Bridge. So while the space was going on at 520 Clinton, it was also the same time when Akai Gurley was murdered at the Pink Houses. So there was actually an open mic that was scheduled at the church for Gaza, for Palestine, and one of the things that we did was cancel that and move that to the streets and take banners and march that day. And in fact, we started from Brooklyn Bridge that day and marched all the way to the Pink Houses in East New York, 1,000 people, with these banners, shutting down different intersections,
20
miles, covering cop cars with the banners. And that was actually a day when there was just people all over Brooklyn and the city shutting down intersections. The Brooklyn Bridge was shut down on the same day. And so you know how banners or these things visuality, how solidarity can also be constructed through these visual things, and then they also have a life of their own afterwards. So I think Palestine for us is also something to think about. We think of it as a litmus test, right? We could be organizing around Gulf labor, we could be organizing around Black lives, we could be organizing around Indigenous struggle, but for some reason, whenever we start organizing around Palestine, in the same context, there's always conflict. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about artist space. But very similarly, Gulf Labor, which we've been part of, and also founded the group Global Ultra Luxury Faction, which had been doing these actions in Guggenheim, mainly around workers who are building the infrastructure on Saadiyat Island. We were invited to the Venice Biennial in 2012 to do research and to present our research from the Gulf. And one of the things that we know about the Gulf is that historically it was Palestinian workers who would go to the Gulf, right? And there was over time, there's the idea of disposable labor, right? So over time there was an effort made to change that labor force, and now we see a lot of the South Asian workers, and also now a surge of African workers coming into UAE to construct these cities. So when we were talking about a boycott in the art world, thinking about Gulf labor and how art institutions are built, we were also thinking about the boycott for Palestine, which is BDS. So when we were at the Venice Biennial, apart from giving our own research, we also went into the Israeli pavilion, which is right next to the Giordani, I think that's the name of the place. That's the Israeli pavilion, actually held an assembly, right? What does it mean to appropriate Palestinian art by Israeli artists in the biennial? On the right hand side you see a banner that says Gaza. I don't know if you have an image. Outside the entire biennial just had tires, rubber tires hung around the biennial, right? But no mention of the occupation or the complicity of the artists within the occupation. And then the other thing that we did was our own banner, which was in the biennial, we made a handala on it, right? So as an act of solidarity, added handala to the image. Do you have anything you would add?
I think just one of the things that you'll notice with the handala as an example, and you'll see it later, of supplementing versus crossing out. It's not the erasure of something that we're interested in. It's the addition to create more space to have a different conversation. It's part of what boycott is trying to do, and this is what's happening here. But also and that's Andrew Ross on the side. But part of what we're doing in this is saying, what does it mean to be made a migrant worker in your own homeland? It requires us, just like it requires us to go beyond saying there is no ban, to say there is no ban on stolen land. It's these additions that we need to actually do that seems counterintuitive, but is necessary for the project of liberation. And that the logic that you need to keep it simple, and you needed to keep it legible, and it needs to be reasonable, is nonsense. It's a different orientation from the power that's dominating over you to each other. And that's power worth building.
So I think in terms of thinking about organizing in the city for BDS, for artists, we've also done, it actually began for us with the Creative Time Summit in 2011, where Creative Time is an arts organization. It's you really engage in social practice kind of art, and they had a summit, and we went in there with Tidal magazine to present on Tidal magazine. But one of the things that Creative Time did was collaborate with institutions, Israeli government-funded institutions, and partnered for the summit. And Mosarin Collective, which is from Egypt, a media-making collective from Egypt, tweeted at us saying that, do you know this is happening? We are boycotting the summit. And from there, different participants who came together, they boycotted the summit as well, which included like Rebel Diaz, who from the Bronx, and people like Michael Rakowitz, us, and Interference Archive. We participated in the summit, but we talked about what BDS is. And why BDS is important to think about for the art world here in New York City. Yeah.
One thing to say is that the issue, it was a gray area for BDS, because the Mosarin withdrew because the event was being live streamed at several Israeli institutions, right, that do receive funding. But Artist Space, Creative Time Summit, denied their ever receiving any funding of that sort. And up until the last minute, they said they were going to make space to talk about BDS and to educate people, because there were thousands of people there, and we thought it was worth that. But of course, it was just a trick. And then they went up and came down after the opening, and they said, look, you got to do what you got to do. So what we did was scrap our presentations and talk about BDS.
The other thing that they did after that was the exhibition Living as Form, which actually included Palestinian artists like Renee and Irene, was then part of like a curator's, so the tour of the exhibition, it was also exhibited at Technion University. In Israel, like people like Decolonizing Architecture, etc., did not know that their work was being exhibited in Israel without people's permission. And so at that time, we again organized and produced a letter which had 100 different culture producers. They signed on to the letter, again asking Creative Time to start the conversation on BDS, to actually adopt BDS, as part of their mission. And so this brings us to just thinking about what has been the different things that have been happening in the city, especially in the context of art, around BDS. And so this is an image that we made, a pamphlet that we made for an action that we did at the Brooklyn Museum in 2015. It began because Brooklyn Museum was doing a show called This Place. And just to give you some background, Creative Time at that time, for the summit, also had invited Tom Finkelpohl, who is now the cultural minister of arts in the city, and had invited Tom Finkelpohl to give a keynote. And one of the things that he said was like, if you are going to criticize Creative Time, then what else do you have? There's nothing that can get better than Creative Time, right? He's the person, he was the director of Queens Museum at that time. He moved on to the cultural minister. At that time, Anne Pasternak was the director of Creative Time, and then she had moved on to be now a director at Brooklyn Museum. And then Laura Rajkovic, who was also a global heads initiative at Creative Time, then eventually moved to Queens Museum. And I don't know how many of you know, she got fired because of co-editing a book with Kareem and Karen Cuny called Assuming Boycott. So that was something, that followed, and just thinking about when you say something about Palestine, what happens in the city. So this is an exhibition called This Place at the Brooklyn Museum. It was curated by Frederick Brenner, and it was basically trying to look at a neutralizing view at Israel/Palestine. And it brought 6 photographers. The curator originally wanted to have Israeli and Palestinian photographers, but most of the Palestinian photographers, actually all the Palestinian photographers said no. So then he decided that he's going to bring in people from outside and have them engage with Palestine and Israel. Each one of them were paid around $70,000 for the project. So people like Jeff Wall, Stephen Shore, Faisal Sheikh, and other were part of the project. But one of the things that we saw that was happening inside the exhibition was the constant images that you saw of Palestinians were dehumanized at checkpoints, in cages. And if you anytime saw Israeli settlers, they were with families, in these like large format, beautiful images, right? And the only time you saw any context of the occupation was either just on walls or, like, as I said, Palestinians or in checkpoint. The other thing was that this exhibition also circumvented BDS because it only involved private funding. So one of the banks that we had the direct action at was part of funding this exhibition. That bank also funds the illegal settlements in Palestine. So there's like always these connections, right? So we were thinking about what kind of action can we do at the Brooklyn Museum. At the same time, while this show was going on the 4th floor, another show was going on which was called Agitprop at the Brooklyn Museum. And now Agitprop is a show which involves like 3 generations of arts activist organizers, people like Martha Rosler, Dred Scott, Dalit Women Fight, like all these different people who we admire their work, they were part of that show. So one of the things that we talked about was like, how can you art wash an occupation in one gallery on the same floor and then talk about social justice right next to it, right? And the third thing that was happening simultaneously was that one of the board members of the Brooklyn Museum, David Berliner, he's a real estate tycoon, was organizing a real estate summit, and the Brooklyn Museum is responsible for a lot of gentrification that happens in that neighborhood. So there were already organizers from Brooklyn Anti-Gentrification Network who were protesting the museum for this real estate summit and forcing them to change the board and the community group that is at the museum. So one of the things that we did was combine these different things, right? To not think of these as separate issue silos, to actually think about settler colonization as a structure and not an event, and bringing that at the heart of Brooklyn Museum and changing the conversation. So this is the cover of the brochure. Some of the posters that we made for that was "We Are Not Tools of Whitewashing Occupation," "Settler Colonialism Out of Brooklyn," "BDS is the For, Not This Eating," "Dump the Fine Art of Gentrification," "The Community Demands at Brooklyn Museum Remove All Real Estate Developers Off His Board," "Host a People's Summit on Displacement." These are some posters.
So again, these are transgressive acts. So we took the strategies and tactics that we would deploy in direct action against the state and the government and said we can do it much easily and more effectively against these institutions. Creating a crisis of legitimacy where they are protested, but the protests are transgressive and they have an impact on their brand and they lose control of the museum and they have a PR crisis. So they can either do the right thing, right, or suffer the consequences which they have to deal with. And that there's a lot of calculations there. Your actions must be perceived as legitimate. You need to organize. None of this actions harmed the museum in a violent kind of way, but it did impact their insurance. It did impact their collectors, right? And it's part of understanding the economy of the art system. Right? So white walls make value, right? And so we'll touch your white walls, and we'll name things the way they are named, not the way you chose to name them. And we won't cover it up. That's what I mean by the supplement. It's that you read Stephen Shore, Large Crater, Negev Desert, and then you read it, Wadi Rumman, Naqab. That's the space that we're interested in. The space in which settler colonialism erases and renames.
Another one of Stephen Shore's.
Just to say, on the other side was simultaneously protesting the gentrification. So it was happening in 2 places at the same time. Posters also went up, and then people gathered outside where there was music and dance and speak outs and banners draped off of the Brooklyn Museum. Again, these institutions are iconic. Their facades are in a way a canvas for us. hack them, and we create our own media. You create your own media, it has a different kind of message. And the message needs to have a different kind of orientation. One that actually feeds into a strategy. And this is why we're talking about a strategy, not unity. A strategy, not all we agree on one program. That's not what I mean. A strategy of separate and together movement towards liberation. Believing in a diversity of tactics. Recognizing that things are connected. Knowing that art needs to measure up to us, not the other way around. That's part of the training and the practice of freedom that Gayatri Spivak talks about and that we've implemented.
So also thinking about the name Decolonize, like taking this place, saying Decolonize this place, but using action, a verb, to then start another project called Decolonize This Place in artist space, right, in 2016. So this is the actions that were done at the Brooklyn Museum were done by a group called Decolonial Cultural Front. There are all these different names that we keep doing, but it based, the formation changes based on what institution we're at, what we're organizing for. So we could have G.U.L.F, DCF, DTP, MTL, they're all like stand-ins for different formations that kind of come together over different periods of time and building one step at a time in terms of thinking about what kind of formation do we need in the city. And I think that brings us to Decolonize This Place because this was actually a starting of what we call decolonial formations, right? Formations or organizing groups that have come together to think through what could decolonizing institutions look like in this city. The starting of that was at Artist Space. Artist Space is a contemporary art gallery in Tribeca. They offered us a 3-month exhibition, and we said instead of using it as an exhibition space, we want to use the space as a commons for the movement. So there was simultaneously two things going on. We were of course pushing the institution to think through what would decolonizing mean for that institution, and on the second end actually using the resources as commons. The rent for that place is $18,000. All the subway lines actually cost through that. It's also the place, it's in Chinatown, and a lot of art galleries are now gentrifying Chinatown, coming from Chelsea because the rent has increased because of the new Whitney coming in there. So there's all of these things going on, right? So when we got the space at Art Space, we were like, okay, to begin this project, what are the relationships that we need to build before we even open? So if you see, we started on September 17th to December 17th. It was also very strategic because September 17th was when 5 years before that Occupy Wall Street had happened. So also changing the landscape of thinking about what kind of movement is needed in this city, and what kind of what kind of work can happen. So we chose 5 strands: Indigenous Struggle, Black Liberation, Free Palestine, Global Wage Workers, and De-Gentrification. Indigenous Struggle because we have to start from the land that we're on, right? And De-Gentrification because that place was in Chinatown. Black Liberation because black and brown people are killed every day. Free Palestine and Global Wage Workers. Do you want to talk a little bit?
No, but I also, that's right. And also, the strategy that we thought of in these 5 years since Occupy is that, in a way, how do we decenter whiteness in our work? And not as our goal is to decenter whiteness, but constitutively, in our own organizing, in our spaces, how can we decenter whiteness? And I felt, and we thought also another thing, and so these strands become important that way. And then the other thing was this idea of the triangulation of indigenous struggle, Black liberation, and Free Palestine can allow for an upending of empire. That's structurally what is required at this point. And when you think about it, how can we talk about Palestine being occupied when we're standing on occupied land? This is again the idea of complicating things, right? And thinking transnationally about this moment. And the other thing I think that's important in thinking about Palestine is that, again, for some reason, cultural institutions are like whatever's hot. You have an uprising in Ferguson, and they put up a show about black people getting killed. They're getting killed all the time. You know what I mean? And so, oh, there's, no DAPL happened. It's like, let's make a show about Indigenous women artists. And so we allow ourselves to be commodified. We become actually instrumentalized in that project of making wealth for others while we remain precarious. Connecting these struggles makes it very difficult for these institutions. They have to confront something. They have to move. And we're talking about institutions here not as a monolithic thing. We know they're complex. We know there are trustees and donors, and those people have money. And we know a lot of us go to school here. I teach here, and we know that art education are some of the most progressive in museums, right? And people need a job, and they have debt. But these are the kind of things that we're thinking about. And then it so happened that artist space is a really kind of recognized place, and we wanted to take advantage of that, which also should point out, it isn't just about being on the outside and contrarian. It's like each time, what is the strategic step to take? And when they told us they'd give us the space, and they would give us a budget of $70,000, we built a movement. That's exactly what we did.
We're going to try and wrap up soon so that
Yeah.
there's time for questions. But I just wanted to read out this quote from Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and K-Win Yang. And we actually looked at this and thought of translating that into the movement and the formations that are needed for this city. So, not unique, the United States as a settler colonial project, settler colonial nation state also operates as an empire utilizing external forms and internal forms of colonization simultaneous to the settler colonial project. This means that this is perplexing to some, that dispossessed people are brought on to seize indigenous land through other colonial projects. Other colonial projects could include enslavement, as discussed, but also military recruitment, low-wage and high-wage labor recruitment, such as agriculture work, overseas trained engineers, and also people from the coast, immigration from nations torn by U.S. wars or devastated by U.S. economic policy. In this set of settler colonial relations, colonial subjects who are displaced by external colonialism, as well as racialized and minoritized by internal colonialism, still occupy and settle stolen indigenous land. Settlers are diverse, not just of white European descent, and include people of color, even from other colonial contexts. This tightly wound set of conditions and racialized globalized relations exponentially complicates what is meant by decolonization and by solidarity against settler colonial forces. And so that's the challenge we took up. What does it mean to kind of build this solidarity? What kind of relationships can we build within the settler colonial project? So this is the space we curated with different banners that were around these strands that we came up with. These banners were temporary on the walls. We made new banners as actions were happening, took them out for actions, brought them back. Different events, which were cultural events, film screenings, food nights, dumpling days. The first banner that went up was actually deoccupy, right? From the shift from occupy to deoccupy. Why would you already occupy something that has been occupied? Like to kind of think about how to decenter the power and the whiteness. And one of the first actions that we did was supporting the NYC Stand with Standing Rock rally that happened actually in Washington Square Park during the Standing Rock movement for the No Access Dakota pipeline. From there, we began a set of actions mainly at the American Museum of Natural History and the Brooklyn Museum, which kind of emerged into. Do you want to talk about this? Because I was just going to go to the.
This is just another example of what. Okay. Yeah. I mean, another example of like the conversation around monuments that was going on, especially Confederate monuments, and it's not just a conversation happening in the United States. It's a conversation happening across the globe, especially in South Africa, where they removed the Gandhi monument, and also in London. So thinking about that conversation is happening, and knowing that this Teddy Roosevelt actually frames the American Museum of Natural History facing east with an indigenous figure on one side an African figure on the other, both subordinated, kind of patriarchal in the sense that they're all kind of, and they're following empire. And that frames the entire museum, which is the most trafficked and also is public, so it gets a lot of tax dollars. And at that time, we were thinking, okay, so there's a conversation around federal monuments, but actually this president was responsible for Puerto Rico, was responsible for eugenics, was responsible for, just it goes on and on and on. That place is one of the most oppressive places in the city. And so, again, thinking something very large that is transgressive, but something more kind of like able to penetrate that kind of visuality. And this also became something that, you know, Chief of Staff of Trump tweeted about, Trump himself addressed, right? Because it was our answer to him. He's just like, well, you're gonna move the monument, the Confederate monuments, what's next, Jefferson? This is like, why not? You know what I mean? Like, and if you look at the tweets or you hear him speak about it, this is a direct kind of conversation that art can have. This stuff simultaneously, you know, it was similar to the material that we had used, where they would have to argue in court that there was permanent harm done to this thing, right? Now, we know other people tried to do this later on, and we know that there was heavy surveillance, there were undercover cops, right? So this is not just like, they are really paying attention to these kind of stuff because they know how harmful it is. Because all of a sudden you get to impact a conversation that's happening nationally. In fact, it's a conversation that's happening globally because we're in New York. In other words, the voices that come out of New York travel because we live in an empire. And at the heart of it, it travels more outward than we receive anything inward.
So this is actually an image from the second Anti-Columbus Day tour, but we've done 3 so far. We did one again on Columbus Day. And one of the things that we've been demanding the museum is to remove that statue, rename the day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and respect the ancestors, which is kind of an overall demand to overhaul the exhibits in the American Museum of Natural History. So if you've gone to the American Museum of Natural History, it's all divided between Asian people, Asian mammals, African peoples. Like, you know, of course, it's a eugenics space. We call it the Hall of White Supremacy. There is no Hall of White Supremacy there. It is a Hall of... Anyways, we can keep going on. But I just want to, like, you know, this is covering the statue there. You know, the community gathering outside. But what I wanted to point out specifically about the American Museum of Natural History in the context of Palestine is we've done, like, you know, we've done these alternative tours where people would go mic check at different points, you know, talk about the different struggles and how we can connect to that. But specifically, they have an exhibit called Jews of Asia, right? And so if you go through the hall, they actually make all the indigenous people who are still living on this land extinct and in the past, repeatedly, through planks, through showing their culture, their dioramas, endlessly, keeps going on and on and on. These were the people who lived here, right? We brought agriculture to this land as if there wasn't agriculture. Like, so this narrative keeps going on, but when you get to the Jews of Asia exhibit, it actually makes the indigenous people living now in Israel. So there's this like kind of a very specific tactical use of indigeneity, right? In what context are indigenous people alive? In what context they're dead and do not exist. And that's something that we highlighted. It was something very, like, you know, crazy to see. Also, the other thing you would see is that one of the arguments that the museum makes is that they don't have the budget to change these halls, right? It's going to take them a lot of money. Like, we just got $500,000 to change the Northwest Coast Indian Hall, and we're working now, you know, all of this. But then you go again in the Asian People's Hall, and you have everything like seeing stolen objects from where, you know, you see the elephants from India, you see like everything, and then the Jews of Asia exhibit is digitized, it has digital lights going on, and you're just like, what is going on in this place, right? So it's, I'm sorry, I just get mad at that. So, so from that place, which was Decolonize This Place, we had the 3-month project. We did the American Museum of Natural History as an action. Also went to Artes, which is Art Israel. It's just a few blocks away from Artist Place, which is kind of a contemporary art organization which takes curators and artists on a tour to Israel. And then this is a solidarity project that we did with the Dignity Strike, where 1,500 Palestinian prisoners went on strike inside Israeli prisons. And so just like thinking through what we could do from the heart of empire and like starting a solidarity initiative. I think we should skip the video. We basically did these projections across New York City. Again, the banner with the fear pattern, and then Palestine, Kashmir, Ferguson, Staten Island, Standing Rock. And then I think we should just end here, which is finally going back again at the Brooklyn Museum when they hired two white curators, one for African art and one for photography. And basically at that time, it was the time when Black Panther had also just come out. And if you remember the scene for Black Panther where Killmonger is standing in front of the glass exhibit and the curator comes in and is like, these are stolen from my ancestors. So that actually became a meme for the Brooklyn Museum where people were like, this is straight out of Black Panther. You have two white curators, specifically one for African art. And so what we did was release a public letter saying that your crisis is an opportunity to decolonize. That we're not just talking about that change the representation of the curators and people in your museum, but actually think about what decolonizing could mean for your institution. And this comes after engaging with the Brooklyn Museum and different institutions in the city repeatedly, or pushing them to think through what would decolonization mean. So here we have decolonization as the main demand with 7 starting points, which, because decolonization does not have an end goal, it doesn't have a map, it's a constant process. So the first one is like having a territorial and land acknowledgement, and not just tokenizing it at that point, but actually changing the relationship of the land with the institution and thinking about what can be done when you are on occupied land. Second is the decentering of the staff in the institution. You usually only find people of color in like management of taking care of the museum, like art workers or janitors. Like that actually should be represented on all different parts of the museum. A decolonial inventory of colonial era objects of both African and indigenous people, an upgrade of working conditions and pay of ground staff, the replacement of the board president, David Berliner, who is a real estate tycoon, a de-gentrification initiative, which actually the museum examines what is the harm that it's creating in its neighborhood, and lastly, an institutional commitment to address the issues raised by BDS, movement in recognition of Brooklynites' role in the settler movement in Palestine. And so this is they want the people of the art, again, having community gatherings inside the institution. Just some images. And then brings us to the public.
Yeah, so
and I just want to say one last thing and close it. For this action, we have 12 groups who came together, right? That's what I mean by the decolonial formations that come together. Apart from Decolonize This Place, there's American Indian Community House, NYC Stand to Standing Rock, Black Youth Project 100, Brooklyn Anti-Gentrification Network, Take Back the Bronx, Chinatown Art Brigade. We actually now have something that we can mobilize anytime. If there's something that happens tomorrow, right, we can actually have a visionary response versus just a reactionary one, which is something that Grace Lee Boggs talked about, visionary organizing versus constantly just reacting to the shit that institutions do. That's it.
These are right now billboards in Palestine, in Ramallah. تصور بيتا بلا ظلم. And then the other one says هناك حرب تشن في الخيال.
You should translate.
There's a war waging in the imagination, or there's a war being waged in the imagination. And then the second one was picture a home without oppression.
That was a lot.
So sorry, there was a lot, and we started late, but just feel free, just kind of, if you can raise your hand and you have a question or a comment.
Okay, it's not. I'm going to try to articulate it with you, so because I'm still thinking with it, so it's going to be messy, but I can bear with you. So I wrote this status on Facebook, right? Asking they think of a good translation for the word imaginary. It was after a discussion with one of my professors, an ex-former professor of mine at the New School sociology professor, who we were discussing how can you translate imaginary in Arabic, is it makhila, is it makhiel, and so on. And so I'm like, wait, let me ask on Facebook just because it's fun, right? So I asked on Facebook, and I was like, amazing, like debates, and like, oh, you shouldn't do this, and Jordanian, Palestinian, Egyptians coming in, like, it's really great. Until one point, one of my friends, a very leftist friend of mine, says, so my professor responds, like, according to dictionary, it's this and this and that, and then my friend comes after him and is in Arabic says, I'm going to translate, forget about those white academics, and then between brackets, al-bayd, al-bayd, and it's like an offense both and a description of whiteness, right? And I've been seeing this all the time, right? Like, I do not want, under any circumstances, to defend white supremacy, but this idea of, like, thinking that whiteness could be marked by names or by looks or by, like skin color is becoming really more and more common, right? Even in like the leftist discourse, it's becoming like, oh, it's such a white party. Oh my God, it's such a white conference. These are people that are like full of white. And I don't want to ever, like, I sat in front of that comment and I'm like, what should I do? Should I respond to the professor and apologize? And why am I apologizing on behalf of another man who's like offending on, like, why am I in this position? Or should I just leave it as it is, or should I start to say, hey, this is unacceptable, like, language, but is it unacceptable language? So I got really, confused about this, what to do in that point, and how to understand why. And at the same time, I'm reading, like, I'm like, who does he identify with this person when he says such a thing as an Egyptian? And then I'm reading at the same time, like, how Egyptian history, which a decade, like 80 years, not a decade, a century, like almost 80 years of colonialism, right? Of British colonialism, and understanding that white belongs to this, like, this white order, this England, that's France, right? But then realizing that the Egyptian history has completely forecasted, like, its colonization of Sudan for, like, years and years and years, right? That this idea that the Egyptian is also a colonizer. It's both a colonized colonizer, right? And so, like, and I'm reading those texts by, like, Egyptian thinkers, intellectuals, and so on, describing Sudan as this blackness and blackness and blackness, and saying about the Sudan as, like, coming to Sudan as a white person, I've noticed how, like, the territories of the Sudan are in this, like, dark, blah, blah, blah. Cartographies, like doing exactly those same, perpetuating those colonial, like, and I'm like, wait, we are white at many points too, and it's like in that sense, like with that history of colonialism, and I'm like, how can you solve these tensions, and how can you not fall into these traps of, like, thinking about, categories in that sense? I don't know, I'm just asking. I have no, like, I'm just, like, wondering, how could it be, that, like, I don't know, like, what do you think? Like, how can you define whiteness? Like, in a place like North Africa, for example, where it's, like, really in between those.
But I don't think, for me, what I hear you think about that is, like, it's not an interesting question for me. It actually frames a struggle in a way I'm not interested in. I'm trying to live, I'm trying to not die. And so is the question for me, is the interesting question for me that I should be engaging with is how to define whiteness? And the answer is no, not for me. We know white is not a pigment. We know it's not a bunch of things. We know that I learned to be white in order to work on Wall Street. We know whiteness is a privilege. We know all these things. But we also know when you're colonized, not everyone is educated. And this is the problem with kind of a reactionary response, because then your resistance is always in response, it's being framed by the thing. The question for you is, what project are you engaged in? And they're not separate. In other words, I see that on Facebook, and then I'm just like, note to self, that's happening. What am I doing? And that's why decolonization is an analytic. helps you create the world you want to see now. But it isn't by addressing, because it just determined your engagement. Now, I also know that if I'm reading it from here and the person writing it from Cairo, for example, you know, we may be Egyptian, but these are also constructs. At the end of the day, it's class, race, gender, sexuality. It's the, you know, I am where I think, right? Not I think, therefore I am. I am where I think. And this is why we do this work. We do it in the sense that for us, occupying Wall Street and taking over the Brooklyn Museum and doing all these things is for Palestine. It's for my home, right? It's for, in 2015, they stopped me from going back. And they stopped, in Egypt, stopped Nitasha from going in a few months ago.
I know.
You know, so it's like, so I think about it that way, you know, it's just like, not interesting. You see it, you know, but I wouldn't, and then there is something, I mean, look, there is some sensitivities, right, which is just like, somehow, you could see it, somehow, and maybe that's coming up because of the curator, but I think that what we're, in other words, there could be a white person, right, a white person, who becomes a professor, who teaches in Princeton, who teaches Arabic. What does it mean then? What is language about? Isn't also about lived experience? Right? In the curator, that was the argument. The argument wasn't that the curator is white, therefore she shouldn't curate African art. It's the fact that first all those African artifacts are stolen. Hey.
And I think one of the things it said was an anti-colonial approach to curation is what the curator, how can you have an anti-colonial approach to colonial stolen objects? Like you're without talking about reparations or repatriation. So.
And is anti-colonialism intellectual? Is that where we're at? Because that's just a commodification of someone else's like business. You know, you need to be doing it. And you know, so I think about that. But what we've done in that context was take what exists, similar to that Facebook post, and say it's an opportunity. We never disregarded what people said. It's coming from a place. They may not articulate it. They may not have the right words for it, right? But they're also, it's that experience. But then the question is, what kind of space are you creating? And that was our point of engagement with the Brooklyn Museum. It was this strategic intervention that actually tried to create something out of it.
I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier that really intrigues me. When you said you were willing to be commodified in a certain way by the art world, and I wanted to see how far that would go. A number of years ago, the artist Fred Wilson was commissioned by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago to come in and do an intervention in the MCA's. The MCA tried to assemble all of its richest collectors and their modernist masterpieces. And so they commissioned Fred to come in, and he went to the Field Museum of Natural History and brought out these, sorry, I've forgotten the name of the artist, but they are these classic colonial sculptures. They are all done in black stone of Zulu warriors and other African figures. He brought them to the museum, and he called the show Centuries. Lined them up in front of the modern masterpieces, so that when you were looking at Picasso, the statues were looking at your shoes. And of course, this was all curated by the director of education at the MCA, who was fired immediately after the exhibition. So my question is, would you accept a commission from the Museum of Natural History or a curator at MoMA who said, we want you to come in and do an intervention. We don't want you to damage any works of art or do any permanent damage to our collection, but we want you to do a critical intervention. Would that interest you, or would you feel it collaborative?
Well, I think the other thing that we didn't talk about is we actually have meetings with the American Museum of Natural History staff about decolonizing. We've had 2 meetings with them, unpaid work, no commission.
Would it matter if they paid you?
Well, I think the thing is, for us, we are facilitators of a process, right? It can't be like, if we have, it won't be me and Amin, right? That we have all the groups that have come together. And I think it would depend on like, what it is, but I think the specific thing, I don't want to use the word community because that's a word often thrown around by institutions like we are doing this for the community when they have no idea most of the times what that means. But in the context of, let's say, if the American Museum of Natural History opened up that process, we've actually demanded to them that the money that they get from the city, they actually stop and start a decolonization commission, like stop the institution, like shut down for a second, figure out what's going on and change these exhibits. So for me, I can answer for myself. I mean, I'm already in the process. I don't think of this, like the actions that we do or the meetings that we sit with them as like, I'm only going to be working against the institution, or what is the institution, right? I swipe a Metro card every day. I'm already accepting this institution. I am a PhD student at State University of New York. Like, I'm already in the institution, right? So there isn't like that fluid binary, and that's not something that we think of. So of course, yes, but I think our process would be very different. And it would actually, we'd be more interested in the process of how that happens.
Yeah, I mean, strategic engagement is important for us. I think that it's okay to say that we're all complicit in the shit that's going down. Mm-hmm. I mean, if someone tells me there isn't, I'd be interested to kind of pursue that further. But I think that I don't really, either I say I wear multiple identities, but I'm not wedded to the idea of artist. I use it strategically, or organizer, or lawyer, or these kind of things. They're labels that we kind of use. But the new museum, we're having an event, and they're just like, hey, can you intervene? And no. I mean, that was straight up no.
No, but I think the intervention's different. I think they literally said that, can you do an action?
Right.
Can we pay you to do an action? We're like, we don't do that. We don't do paid actions. So yeah.
I think one of the things that maybe we can end with is like, when we thought of Decolonize This Place, we were seeing how movements, if there's any way to understand what we're doing, is to understand it more as a movement. And if you understand it, and if you're an artist, then think of yourself, what does art look like that's embedded in struggle and movement, that is decolonial? From that point on, in the moments where it's weak, when the movements are weak, we target institutions and map out sites of injustice and figure out areas of solidarity and bridging and building power. This is what we're doing. And part of what we're saying to ourselves is the economy is going to crash. This is just a matter of time. It was in Newsweek right now. It's been going on. If you ask people that work on Wall Street and the law firms, they're already seeing the numbers go down. Is it 2019, the second half? Is it 2020? You saw the elections. You see how divided we are. This is what we're trying to tell people, is that people should be thinking ahead. There's ways in which you can think ahead and be strategic, and this is what we're doing. We're getting spaces, we're training younger people, it's about how do we take over our city, right, in all the ways possible. And I think that if a museum is going to give us $70,000 and give us a space, the question we'll never say no to money, no strings attached. But we won't do something that they want us to do. And I never said that I'm willing to be commodified, but I'm recognizing that I'm complicit and I intervene inside and outside in those kind of relations that way.
Yeah, I didn't mean by that to say I thought you were selling out.
Yeah. No, I appreciate
Any more than I do.
But I think we also want to honor people's time, and it's 5:30, and I know there's a major lecture. We're just shooting the shit now.
Any other questions? No, you good?
I have a question actually. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the recent change in the captioning at the American Natural History Museum, and if you see that as a success or a shortcoming or both.
Well, they actually did that before our third anti-Columbus Day. So
A little bit of it.
Oh, there's been more of that? Then you should talk more about it.
Yeah, the post that we put on Facebook pretty much sums up our position after consultation, which is just like, this direct action does the pressure does result in outcomes. And I think that those captionings of stuff is
They also just hired a first Indigenous curator
yeah.
for the Northwest Coast House.
Yeah.
It's a starting.
And so the narration is a recognition of the past, but at the simultaneously they keep it in the past. And that's something that we're telling them in terms of settler colonization. It's not an event, it's a structure. We're living in it, right? And so that it falls on that front. It also just said that indigenous people who were genocided contributed to commerce. That's like saying, you know, oh, the enslaved, we want to recognize that there was an enslavement of a people and they contributed to our commerce. Right? As a way to give them value, right, of human beings. But I think that it also proves how easy it is for them to overhaul their hall of white supremacy in a way that doesn't harm and reproduce trauma in children and people every day who are mandated to go to that museum.
But I think other thing is that this was something that they had spoken to us in our meetings, which is the idea of plaques. That's for some reason is their most favorite thing. We don't want to remove the statue, but we can put a plaque up there. Like the plaques are like this, like as if they will fix anything. And I think one of the same things is like those are great like starting points, but we're talking about reparations and repatriation, right? Like
I mean, they have Nama skulls.
I mean, there's what's going on in that
tons of
museum
shit.
is insane. Like it really is. Like it's
Yeah.
insane. Like the kind of ancestors they hold. It's like that needs to be just gone.
One last question there was a
Yeah.
Yes. Hopefully the answer is, short or also,
Yeah.
elaborate later. How can a prospective volunteer work with you? I think, based in New York or elsewhere, what are some ways to collaborate with you, join you guys online, in person?
One of the things that we're doing right now is trying to secure a major space in Brooklyn for exactly that purpose as a headquarters for these kind of formations. The other thing is I'm a professor here and I teach at, one of the places I teach at is, where?
Media communication
Yeah,
culture,
yeah, no,
Gallatin.
but Gallatin. But in my 25, so my undergraduate Gallatin class, there's 4 students who are actually going to be kind of helping out with the formation.
As
So
independent studies.
it may not be Decolonize This Place, because again, Decolonize This Place, and we could have talked more about this, but there are 10 people that kind of move it along and do issues around aesthetics, around kind of facilitating, but there's over 35 groups in the city, and all of them are Black or people of color led. So you remember what I was saying in 2014, like that's really how you decenter whiteness in the organizing. So stay tuned on Instagram. Instagram is one of the most important places to kind of keep up with
Because we also do
pedagogy,
pop-ups, like,
Yeah.
and then specifically when we start organizing actions, we put out like, a call for people to come for meetings, especially production parties. That's actually a very
Yeah.
good way to plug in, because whenever we're organizing actions, we have production parties where we make dynamics and people can come and do different roles during the action.
We maintain it on Signal, right? And then only in times where there's something going to happen do we meet. Because we know organizing kills movements, organizing meetings.
A meeting for another meeting
Yeah.
for another meeting.
Terrible.
Thank you so much.